Okay, now I got the spindle out and chucked up in the vise. And what I got to do is get this woodruff key off and then get this spacer off. I think this is just for the pulley. Make sure the pulley sits in the right spot. And then I can drive the shaft out of the housing. There's a bearing at the top and there's a bearing at the bottom. So driving it out is not that big of a deal. I'm going to throw these bearings away, so I don't really care what I do to them. When it goes back together, I got to be careful though. I got to drive everything together the right way and not put any preload into the bearings or damage the bearings. I was initially going to use a press to reassemble this, to take it apart and reassemble it, but most people don't have a press, and I've done this successfully before with a big hammer and sockets and drifts and stuff like that. So that's what I'm going to try to do. I tend to be kind of brutal getting the woodruff key out. Success. It even went behind the bench. Easy. Just like that. Okay, let's see if we can get this area cleaned off and get the snap ring out. Pretty sure there's a snap ring in there. Okay, well I don't see a snap ring, so there must be only one on the inside. Let's check the underside of it. Oh, look at this. Is that grease? Yeah, I think that's a bunch of grease that leaked out of that joint for years and years. Oh yeah, here's a snap ring right here. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll get the snap ring out. Then I think I can drive this bearing out through the other side using a drift. There's a spacer in here that I can move around, and I don't know if you can see it or not, but I can move that around and I can get a drift on this inside race, and it'll drive this bearing right out of the housing. Okay, to get the snap ring out, I try prying on it with a couple screwdrivers. One prying in this direction, the other one to get under it and get it up out of its groove. Usually takes several minutes. There's probably an easier way, there's probably a good tool, but this is how I choose to struggle to do it. Gee, it worked in practice. Okay, after struggling for several minutes, what I ended up doing was driving against the inner race here, because I think the outer race of the bearing was up against the snap ring, putting a bunch of load on it and making it tough to get out of the bore. So let's try it again and see if I can walk it out of there. Oh yeah, now the ring spins in the bore, so it had a bunch of load on it. Now it's just going to want to spin. Got me. Okay, I think I finally got it. What I had to do was, one, turn the camera off. Two, instead of prying like this, put the screwdriver in like this, like this, and then turn, and then get screwdriver number 2 underneath it. Now the camera's on, so now it's not going to cooperate. Oh, there we go. There we go. There we go. And once you get it out of the groove, it'll come right out. There we go. Now that the snap ring is out, I can go ahead and try to drift the lower bearing out. I just take this drift and I push the bushing or the spacer over that's in the bore and tap against the inner race. I try to work around a little bit. I can feel it moving. It's going to come right out. Okay, here we go. There's the spacer. I'm going to go ahead and pull it out. Plenty of grease in there. Almost wonder if someone's been in here before. Got the other bearings down in there still. So what I'll do is I'll drive that one out the same way. I won't record that, but that's how you get the bearings out. Okay, got this guy all apart now. And what I found was there are 2 snap rings for the bottom bearing. There are no snap rings for the top bearing. This is a little bit different than others that I've built. I've rebuilt probably 5 or 6 of these cast housing type spindles. These are usually in older tractors. The newer ones are like my X300. They're an aluminum housing with the bearings kind of pressed in, and then the shaft kind of seats inside the inner race of the bearings. They're not really pressed together very well. You can tap them apart with a hammer pretty easily. This older style, they're put together pretty tight, which makes them a little difficult to work on, but they're very rebuildable. And another thing I notice is these bearings are a little bit different from one another. This one's got it's got the brand and the nomenclature on it. This one doesn't have anything on it, and the seals are a different color. Someone else has worked on this before for sure, and after kind of studying these bearings, they feel really good. I probably didn't need to mess with this, but I mean this one feels really good. This one's got a little bit of grind to it, but it could be from me beating on it with a hammer. I may have damaged it. So, oh well, hindsight is what it is. I'm going to go ahead and put it together with new John Deere bearings. And I think what I'll do is, because these actually go in pretty easily, and it's kind of a tight fit, but it's not nearly as tight as the shaft and the inner race. I can tap these in and then drive the shaft in through here and support the inner race when I do that. That way it won't put any preload on anything. It's really important that you don't just put everything together and then beat it to death with a hammer. That's really hard on the bearings. So I'll avoid doing that. And then the other side, I think I can just drive the bearing in over the shaft via the inner race. Okay, so I think I'm ready to put the new bearing in. I went ahead and I cleaned out the snap ring groove really well. Typically, I'll spray the stuff down with solvent and clean it all up, but this thing was so clean, I didn't do that. I just wiped it off with a clean towel. Try to get that installed nice and square. And then something that can work really well to drive it in is the shaft itself. I can pile it right on there like that. And I got a nut on the end of the shaft to hit against, so I'm going to try to drive it in just like that. Going in really easy. Okay, so that's topped out. I got to drive it in below the snap ring groove. I might use one of the old bearings to do that. Got to check this periodically so I don't get this stuck in the bore too. I still have to drive it in a little bit more to get below the snap ring groove. This trick isn't working very well anymore because now this bearing's getting stuck in the bore. A lot of people put this on a grinder and grind off the OD a little bit, and then it'll slide in and out. I'm not going to go through all that. I don't have a good bench grinder. But what I can do is get my punch, my little punch, and just gently drift it in, hit it maybe 3-4 places about the outside diameter of this. Just got to be really careful. It's going. Okay, got that bearing in there. Now I just got to get the snap ring in. Okay, for my next trick, I've got to drive this shaft into here, but I can't just drive against the bearing by itself. That'll damage it. I've got to support the inner race with something. And what I've chosen to do is use a deep well socket that fits over the shaft, and I can support the assembly that way. So now when I drive against this, it'll react against the socket against this inner bearing rather than the outside of the housing. That would cause preload. We don't want to do that. Goes in pretty hard, but it doesn't hurt the bearing at all. It's freewheeling, it's just fine. Okay, so now the shaft is actually bottomed out against the inside of the socket. So it's not going down anymore. But remember, I got the spacer. It goes inside. I can use that. Actually, I'll get a shorter socket now. There, brought you out a little bit so you can see everything a little bit better. Time for a longer socket. I can add this one too, give it a little more length. Hopefully that's all I need. Okay, now the shaft is touched up against the inner race. I can feel it. Last little bit went on real easy, so the shaft must have some taper to it. All right, so for the assembly, this has to go in, the spacer. And then the inner race of the top bearing will touch up against that, and that's how it'll stay seated. We got to make sure we pack some grease in here. Even though these are sealed bearings, and you have this empty cavity here, we want to put grease in there, and that'll help cool it. And as it gets warm, it'll become less viscous, and it will still help lubricate the bearings somewhat. Okay, for my next trick, I'm going to put some grease inside the bore here. I try to fill it up maybe 3/4 full. I'm just going to use a standard, like bearing grease. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. Not for this. I usually just get a plastic knife out of the kitchen and start packing it in there. It is possible to put too much grease in there because I know because I have done it. Last year at some point I had a assembly just like this, and I put I put so much grease in there I couldn't put the bearing in. I couldn't put the top bearing in. It hydrolocked, and I kept pressing on this thing and pressing or pounding. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure I was pounding it in, actually, and it just wouldn't go in. And I realized I had put a ton of grease in the thing, and that was the problem. I had to take the thing back apart, and I scooped some of the grease out, and after I did that, it went back together no problem. Okay, I think that's plenty. Okay, last bearing. Oh man, wish it would slide on more than that. So just like last time, I gotta get a socket, spacer or something, and drive that on. Make sure, yeah, I did put that spacer in there. I'll start with it. Start with this little chrome socket. It pilots over that shaft really well. Going in nice and nice. Well, it's going in pretty hard, but it's supposed to. It's press fit on the ID. This OD is more of a slip fit, I think. So it actually doesn't, it didn't go on any harder once it got into the bore. Should touch up against that inner spacer. Oh, there it is. Let's make sure it spins freely, and it does. It feels really nice. Feels like it's got 2 new bearings in it. Good deal. Now I got to find that woodruff key, put that back in there. Probably have to clean it up a little bit. It's under the bench somewhere. And that's it.